Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to show you my Pirc repertoire, the opening named after Vasja Pirc, a Slovenian Grandmaster, not Pirc, not Pirc. That's one advantage Slavic people have, that they usually know how to pronounce weird opening names. So the Pirc is a very complex opening. It's a hyper-modern opening where black allows white to take up the center and occupy the center with e4 and d4. And in many ways, that's a big problem. And if you don't know your lines, you're going to encounter very early e5 advances or kingside attacks. So what I want to do today is give you a very simple Pirc repertoire you can play as black and avoid problems. I've chosen lines that are, some of them are uncommon, some of them are sort of main lines, and I've chosen them based on how tricky the variations white goes for are. So the first thing we need to know, white's the one choosing the variations. And I want to say something before we start on the Pirc. If you need a complete repertoire, I've created a King's Indian repertoire for black. And since in most cases, black in the Pirc plays g6, d6, and attempts to play e5, that's very similar and complementary to the King's Indian. Those two go well together. So in the description below, you can find both repertoires, the King's Indian and the Pirc repertoire. You can download them, use the PGN, and follow along. You can also practice both of them on Nocti. So the King's Indian and the Pirc give you a complete repertoire with which you can play against e4, d4, c4, knight f3, even the Dutch. Okay, so what are we going to be looking at? First of all, there, as I said, white decides the variation. White's the one who chooses the nature of the position. When you play the Pirc, which begins with e4, d6, white can do many different things. And if you get the King's Indian repertoire, you will know what to do against c4 and knight f3. But the main move is d4. And the Pirc is also applicable against the Jabava system. So if they start d4, knight c3, and we play knight f6, their best move is e4. So white decides the nature of the position, and there are 8 main setups for white. The easiest way to learn any opening, including the Pirc, is to play it out and develop a skill instead of accumulating tons of theoretical knowledge and learning all the lines. That's what I use Nocti for. So instead of going through lines and trying to memorize them, I play the opening out. I've imported the Pirc repertoire. You can find the link below. You can also find the link to the King's Indian for black. And I've created tons of openings, as you can see, so you can find a lot of stuff there. Basically, what you can do is 2 things, and here are the 2 things I do. Firstly, I use themes to set up positions from the opening I'm trying to learn, whether it's prep for a game or a specific opening. And then secondly, you can play games in a repertoire. So for the Pirc, let's say we want to play it out. So let's say we want to play the Pirc. Choose a side. Let's say I want to play black. Choose a time control. Choose Nocti's difficulty. And Nocti is going to play like a human would. Okay, so once you start playing, you're going to be getting immediate feedback. And Nocti is going to be playing the moves from your repertoire. And it's going to make studying the Pirc and then it plays the column of interesting. It's going to make studying any opening much easier. If you decide to go premium on Nocti and unlock all the features, use the code Hanging Pawns to gain a massive 64% discount. The Pirc repertoire is also available on my Patreon page, as well as many other repertoires. So is the King's Indian one, the anti-King's Indian, and the King's Indian for black. So what you can do if you would like to support the channel, you can purchase each PGN separately, or you can become a member for just $4 US a month and gain access to all of these repertoires, including E4, D4, Sicilian, Caracan, French, Italian, QGD, and many others for just $4 US a month. Thank you. The first one we're going to be looking at is the so-called Austrian attack. It's called the 4 pawns attack in other openings. Like if there was a pawn on c4, that would be the 4 pawns in the King's Indian. This is the most aggressive way to play. According to theory, it's the most aggressive mainline way to play. I don't think it's the most aggressive. I'm going to show you what is. Then, moving on, we're going to be looking at the classical Pirc. The classical Pirc is what I most commonly play. My biggest win is against Goran Antunac. He is a Croatian international master. I had white from this position, and even though this may seem slightly passive, and you're not immediately playing for e5, the classical approach is the safest approach. Okay, so those two, the Austrian attack and the classical, are the main lines. Then we're going to have a look at 6 slightly uncommon variations that aren't the main lines. The first one is the very quick bishop e3, queen d2. So white completely ignores what black's doing and just wants to castle queenside and play bishop h6. This is very straightforward, and it's very similar to the Yugoslav or the English attacks in the Sicilian. Normally, white's going to play f3 at some point, but they don't have to. If knight g4 is played in this position, you may wonder, there's bishop g5, and that's similar to the King's Indian. So bishop e3, queen d2. After that, we're going to have a look at the Holmov. This is very similar to what white does in the mainline Philidor. So if black ever plays e5, which, depending on what white does, could happen, we are going to transpose into a g6 Philidor. So a complementary opening to the Pirc, which is very similar if black plays e5, other than the King's Indian, is the Old Indian / the Philidor. That's basically the same opening depending on whether there's a pawn on c4 or not. So the position with the pawn on e5, bishop e7 is the Philidor or the Old Indian, and if you have the bishop on g7, it's the King's Indian or the Pirc. So the whole move. After that, we're going to have a look at the Byrne variation, named after Robert Byrne, not burning. This is what I have been preparing for a long time as white, because most people are going to play bishop g7 here, and bishop g7 leads to some crazy lines. My prep with white was bishop g7, e5, and now black really has to be careful. If this pawn is taken, the knight could come to b5, c7 is under fire, and black can easily lose, even though the engine says the positions are roughly equal. So against the Byrne, against bishop g5, we simply aren't going to play bishop to g7, we're going to play c6 in this repertoire. And the reason we play c6 is we simply control these squares. And in all the lines where e5 does happen, there's no problem on c7. After the Byrne, we're going to be looking at the Sivnikov system. You can also call it the g3 Pirc. It doesn't really matter. This is a very positional approach, and you get these positions you get these in the Vienna, you get these in basically any opening. But g3 systems without the pawn on c4 are kind of different, because white does need to take care of the center, and it's going to be very hard to prevent advances like b5. So what we're going to do against this is a very, very nice Sreti in reverse. Okay. After that, we're looking at early bishop d3, and when white plays against the Pirc and black plays knight f6, well, there are a couple of ways to play against this, and white needs to defend the pawn on e4. There are 3 ways to do it. Knight c3 is all the main lines, and bishop d3 and f3 are the alternatives. Okay, the bayonet attack. This is wild and crazy, but not really if black knows what they're doing. White's idea is a very quick bishop e2 followed by h5. Of course, you don't want to castle into this because h5 comes. So that would make no sense. And finally, we're going to have a look at what used to be my favorite way to fight the Pirc and the modern f3. And this is the lion's jaw. This is not the Pirc at all. And I'm not going to be showing you theory. In fact, I want to show you one single thing that you need to pay attention to. So my biggest win against the Pirc was Goran Antunac, but the second biggest, maybe Medak was higher rated. My two highest rated wins ever were against the Pirc. One of them was the classical, the other one was f3. And basically the thing white wants to do here is g4, knight e2, followed by knight g3 and g5. And that means that if, well, black can do many things, but let's say e5. If e5, which is what I would recommend, white's position immediately makes very little sense. And the plan I just showed you cannot be implemented. So after d, de, queen d8, this is the typical queen exchange in the Pirc. I think this is a great position. And after bishop c4, king e8, we're going to play c6 and have a very, very slow game. I just want to continue showing you what would happen if white played carelessly. So say, for example, c4 and bishop g7 and knight e2 and castles, and g4 isn't a great move, but I want to show you the idea. If g5 is allowed here, then after knight h5, knight g3, what do? I'm going to take that knight and open up the g file. If you take, the h file is open. And the way I'd won against Bojan Medak is I managed to get my queen to the h file, cause problems on h7. Now, the engine says this is equal, but it's very difficult for black to play this position. Of course, white has pushed all the pawns, and the position makes no sense. But if the queen comes to h2, it's going to be game over. So just remember that against f3, you don't play your normal Pirc. It's not the Pirc in any case. You play e5. Okay, so those are the 8 variations we're going to be looking at, with the addition of this lion's jaw, which we just had a look at. Let's begin with the Austrian attack. So the Austrian attack is what many strong players used to play, Bobby Fischer among others, and you should have a look at. Oh, my brain isn't working. Fischer's rook f6 sacrifice. Fischer, was that against Benko? I think it was against Benko. In any case, it was this opening. So white is strengthening e5, and e5 is going to happen. And black's main idea, as I said, in the King's Indian and in the Pirc, is to advance with e5. Against the Austrian attack, we just aren't going to be able to do that. So bishop g7. Now, white can push e5 straight away, but it's not that good. Still, if they do, on d5, if they play fe5, we can safely play knight d5. Okay, and if they play d5, we can safely exchange queens and go knight g4. And this knight's going to be sitting on f5. Once again, everything you see here and more is in the repertoire. So I want to focus on ideas during the video, and you can study the lines yourself. Now, most people are simply going to go knight f3 here. The alternatives are playable. White can also go bishop d3 and then knight f3, but it's going to transpose. Okay, so castles. Now, here there's a major branching. Bishop d3 is the main move, but there are many, many alternatives. Against e5, once again, d5, fe5, knight d5. And that's the only sort of critical line. They can also play bishop e3 or bishop e2, which doesn't make such a big difference. Bishop d3, as I said, is the main move. All the other moves are in the repertoire. Okay, against this, black has options, many options, and the most common ideas are knight a6 and knight c6. I like the move knight c6. Now, we shouldn't really worry about e5, and even though it's the main move, it's not problematic. You may think, well, where does the knight go? But after e5, we actually get to move this knight to h5. So after d5, fe5, again on d5, knight d5. I always recommend that. On fe5, knight h5. And g4 isn't playable. White isn't winning a piece because of bishop takes g4. And now we see the consequences of a hypermodern opening. So when white plays, classically in the center and has pawns on e4 and d4, and black waits by developing on the flanks and aims to disrupt that center, at some point something like this is going to happen, where white's pawns aren't mobile. d5 would lose the e5 pawn, and they aren't defended. d4 isn't defended, so what does white do? White cannot simply continue with castling, so white must start defending. Bishop e3, and we continue increasing the pressure, bishop g4. So this is our idea, and this is why we aren't afraid of e5 in the Austrian attack. And in order for the Austrian attack to work, white's going to have to babysit these pawns. Okay, so now again, d4 needs defending, so bishop e2, and we start undermining again, f6. e6 loses a pawn, so they must take ef6, ef6. Now the e file is open, so after castles, rook e8. And the bishop's hanging. Again, bishop d2 loses the pawn. Queen d2, knight e7, where's the knight going? Well, either to f5 or to d5, setting up a blockade. So remember, against the Austrian attack, when they push e5, you want to make sure that you disrupt that center straight away. Now again, there are alternatives, and I want to show you one critical line after knight c6. If white doesn't push e5 straight away, if they castle or do anything else, then we go e5. And this may seem crazy because we're allowing d5 and opening up the f-file, but actually challenging this center, blocking this bishop, makes a ton of difference. So fe, de, d5, we have knight d4. You may think, well, that hangs the pawn. Not really. After knight takes e5, knight takes d5, and the knight on e5 is hanging. So once all the trades happen, something like bishop f4, maybe knight c6, queen d2, bishop e6. You can see that black's perfectly fine. Black has equalized, and the pawn on e4 is not only isolated and weak, but it actually hinders white's activity because it blocks the bishop on d3. So if they don't play e5 very quickly, play e5 yourself. Okay, moving on to the classical Pirc. One thing I want to talk about, because I had this as white many times, is the dark squared bishop, the light squared bishop on c8. This is a problem piece for black. So when I have white here, I play h3 before bishop e2, and I think that's a very good idea. If white at any point manages to play h3, it's not at all clear where this bishop is going to go. And normally what I like to do as black, when I was preparing this repertoire, I was struggling with what to do against an early h3. Normally, I would only consider this position for white. So if black castles, white does something, then there's a very nice idea to gain control over the f5 square, and that's d5. Now, whether white pushes with e5 or not is irrelevant. If they trade, even better. But in any case, we gain control over f5 because there's no way for them to defend e4 with a pawn. e5 makes most sense, and now knight e4. We don't go backwards. We don't lose the knight with knight g4, of course. We also don't want to go knight e8. So knight takes, pawn takes, knight g5 putting pressure on the pawn, and there's a tactical way to justify this pawn sacrifice, c5. And I was really happy when I discovered this variation. This has only been played 10 times. Black has a great score, actually. So they take on e4, we take on d4, bishop takes d4, and now bishop f5. And look at this activity. Instead of having a buried bishop on c8, e5 is weak, we're playing knight c6, our bishops are monsters, we have a lead in development because our king is safe, white's 2 moves away from castling, and I think this is just a great solution to white's early h3. Now, most people are going to continue bishop e2 and, you know, allow you to develop. Now, you might be thinking, why not play bishop g4 straight away? Well, if you play bishop g4 straight away, white could go either e5 or h3 and then e5 at an opportune moment. So I really prefer castling before we get that bishop out. So castles. And Again, white has the opportunity to play h3, but in this classical system, h3 is the most sensitive move. You shouldn't treat h3 here as if you would treat it in the Spanish or in the Italian, like nothing move preventing bishop g4. No, it's the critical idea here. If white plays h3 now, excuse me, black is the first to strike in the center with c5. And the king still hasn't castled, so h3 was premature and bad. I assume they want to take. Okay, and now queen a5. Look at this. And white's in trouble. I mean, the engine says the position is fine, but you could lose within seconds here. So I don't think h3 is precise at all. Let's say cd, knight e4, d7, rook e8. Let's say they castle. We just grab the knight on c3 and play knight c6. We're going to regain this pawn. This one's going to fall. White doesn't have a good position. I mean, you can say whatever you want, but this isn't a good position for white. And nor do they have any typical Pirc activity. So moving back after castles, white should castle. And once they do, now we're safe to go bishop g4, finally. Because e5 isn't scary, our queen is defended by the rook, our king isn't going to get misplaced, we don't have to panic. Now, white can do many things. When I have white here, well, I normally don't, but if I get myself into a position where I haven't played h3, I'm just going to go bishop e3 and get on with my life. It's imperative to prepare for black's e5 at this point. And what I mean by that, at some point, black is going to go either knight d7 or knight c6, followed by e5. Once a trade happens, and I would really encourage you to look at my game against Goran Antunac. It's in the Road to GM playlist. Once e5 is played and d5 happens, whoever has a better square for their queen is going to be strategically better. So you'll often see black playing c6 and queen c7, or e5 and queen e7. White ideally wants the e2 square for the queen. And in many, many cases, white's the one who has trouble placing the queen on a safe square because there's a bishop on e2, which is exactly why we as black should not take on f3 unprovoked. So if white continues, bishop e3, knight c6, queen d2, not a safe square for the queen because now we play e5. And after d5, white either plays rook d1, okay, which makes sense. And then we play queen e7, and we have the d file. We have the d file. So now we're going to go rook d8, and the queen's going to have to move. And the queen's going to have to move to an awkward square. Queen c1 may in fact be the best move here. If white plays knight d5, we can just exchange that and go knight d4. Because after knight d4, e d4, this bishop cannot really take because the bishop on e2 is hanging. So after bishop g4, d3 is great. And if in this position, if in this position they take on g4, which they have to do, we're just going to take on e3, and after queen e3, f e3, we now have a very pleasant choice between rook e8, not bishop b2 because rook b1, but you can see that this position is perfectly equal. So if we aren't provoked to take on f3, we don't take on f3. If white, however, plays h3, which I think is strategically very justified, and in some cases, I mean, it's really hard to tell whether h3 is smart or not. But if they do play it, we take on f3, and now they have a square for their queen. So after e5, which we must play, d5, d5, white has a couple of options. If they go queen e2, black is supposed to be slightly better, but I actually think that this is better than trading queens. And something like knight c6, rook d1, queen e7, or knight d4 even. Knight d4 could be better. So white is the first to challenge the d file. If they do, however, trade queens, that's perfectly fine. And, just we got to the d file first. So if they play h3, we trade. That's the classical. It's very rich, and you could study it for years. There's a book by John Nunn. It's an old book, but so far it's the best book on the Pirc I've ever held in my hands. It's called The Complete Pirc, and it's great. You can his explanation of the classical is the best one out there, I think. Okay, let's move on to the battery. Okay, there are many ways to play against this. As I said, knight g4 isn't one of them because bishop g5. And what does white want to do? It's a very simple question. White wants to castle queenside, so let's play against that. So I prefer to move a6 to all the other more common lines. Now this is not only to prepare b5, but it's also to prevent knight b5 and bishop b5 in all the lines. Now white could conceivably castle queenside here, although it's an okay move, but we would go b5. So a6 sort of discourages very quick castling, and if something like f3, b4, if knight a4, now knight c6, and this knight is misplaced. So most people, when they see a6 on the board, are going to think twice and actually play bishop h6, because it's very scary to castle when someone plays a6. It's not a subtle move. Okay, so the bishop came to h6. We don't want to castle into white's attack, so we take on h6. Queen takes h6, and we don't worry about queen g7. It does nothing. We have rook g8. So knight bd7, castles, and now e6. You might be thinking, why not e5? Well, because there's rook opposite our queen. That would be suicidal. Bishop e2, queen e7. Now the queen is off the d file, and this is one of the most important things about this early queen d2 and castles line. You want to play e6 first if they have already castled. If they haven't castled, then you can play e5 and then follow that up with queen e7. If they have castled, e6, queen e7, and then e5. Okay, f4. Knight b6, I think, is an interesting move because it frees up the d7 square, and once the e5 pawn advances, your bishop's going to be open. g4 and e5. And now you can see the benefit of knight b6. Of course, this should really not be taken. Definitely not twice. Maybe h3, just defending the pawn. That's what I would do with white. If they do take fed d, we just take on g4, and this is massive for black. So again, bishop e3 and queen d2, not a big deal. The call move. The call move is, as I've said, very, very similar to the Philidor if black manages to play e5, but we probably aren't going to manage that. So bishop g7, white can play queen e2, or white can play knight f3. Queen e2 is the main move, and this frees up the possibility of castling either side, and it overprotects the pawn. But it undefends d4. So white's preparing e5, putting all of their eggs into one basket, and if they don't play it now, if they, I don't even know what to suggest. If they play something like knight f3, then we go bishop g4 again, putting pressure on the pawn, and then bishop e3, again defending, and then castling, and it's not really clear why the queen is on e2. So most people, excuse me, on knight c6 are just going to go e5. And here I'm going to recommend a very tactical sequence, which you simply have to learn. We're going to take on d4. We're going to try to punish white's play. And this is a well-analyzed line. It's a well-known queen sacrifice. White takes on f6. We grab the queen. They take on g7. And now we have to go rook g8, of course. They take on e2, and we take on g7. And if we take stock, queen for 3 pieces, queen and 2 pawns for 3 pieces. I had a long look at this position, and it was one of the reasons I wanted to play the call move myself. But after careful consideration, I decided that I preferred this for black. If you turn on the engine says 0, 0, 0, which is no surprise. After something like bishop h6, rook g8, white, of course, has 2 very dangerous bishops. They're going to castle queenside, but we have the center, and we're going to have a great central structure, whatever happens. Even if white pushes the f pawn and the c pawn and exchanges, let's say, e5 and d5, we'll still maintain 2 pawns in the center. So there will be no way for white to challenge this. And white is the one who needs to play very energetically, because if we castle, get our rooks into play, start pushing the central pawns, then black has an advantage. Okay, the burn. As I said, the burn is very tricky, very, very tricky. And I'll show you my prep again. So if bishop g7, e5, if this pawn is taken, which is the engine recommendation, then, you know, if you exchange queens, you're in a world of pain. Let's say knight h5, which is a very natural move. Knight d5 and the game is over. It's over. Knight a6, bishop a6. This is the sort of position I was trying to get. And you can see that black is losing. So we're not going to be playing that. We're going to play the move c6, a very simple move that prevents all the attacking ideas involving a knight jump into d5 and b5, making e5 almost obsolete. It really makes no sense to push e5 now. Okay. So white goes queen d2, developing, and we go b5. I mean, why not? We're claiming space. Bishop d3, developing, knight bd7. They can play f4, they can play many different things. Now we can safely play bishop g7, and white's playing a sort of Austrian attack type setup where we already have a pawn on b5, so that's great. They castle kingside, we can go knight b6, playing for c4. For example, we can go b4, misplacing the knight. It's just a very imbalanced position where white's pretending to be doing something on the king side and black's pretending to be doing something on the queen side. So the basis of our repertoire against the burn is to play c6. Remember, when people play g5, they play it in order to push e5 and destroy you on c7 and down the d5. Okay, the sivnikov with g3. Now, this is no problem at all. Bishop g7, bishop g2 castles. White's going to go knight g2 and probably at some point play h3. But I'm going to recommend the system that no one plays. This is a well-known position, and the two main moves are c5 and e5 by far, and they make most sense. But what we're going to do has only been played a handful of times. Rook b8. And the idea behind rook b8 is very simple and very aggressive. Firstly, if allowed, we play b5. So white must prevent b5, in my opinion. So white goes a4. And now we play c5. Notice how the rook isn't on the diagonal anymore, how our b pawn is mobile. So white does something, let's say h3, b6. And we're playing a perfect reti in reverse. Something like bishop e3, cd4, bishop d4, bishop d7. This is a wonderful position where we haven't committed to anything in the center. We have a typical reti double fianchetto and many, many targets. I mean, white doesn't have any advantage here, in my opinion. And if I had to choose, I would take black. According to the engine, it's 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. And I wonder why more people don't play this with black. You basically get the reti with colors reversed, where a single tempo matters very little, and white did not play with white pieces. White has no opening advantage. All right, early bishop d3 is just another way to defend e4, and against this, we play e5, of course. And we're going to step away from our typical Pirc ideas, challenge the d-pawn. If this is exchanged, white doesn't get to trade queens. So bishop d3 is a move that we simply must punish by playing e5. And then we can do everything else. White can go d5 here, which leads to a very, very standard old Indian after c4. But their bishop wishes it was on e2. So, bishop d3 makes little sense here. And now we have many typical plans. One of my favorites is a5, knight a6, knight c5, which is the common King's Indian, old Indian plan. And of course, playing for f5, if allowed. So that's what happens if they play d5. If they ignore you, then you exchange on d4, knight takes d4, and you have a typical Philidor where you can choose between g6 and bishop e7, but I prefer g6 because we're playing the Pirc after all. So bishop d3 really isn't a scary move, just play e5. And finally, this crazy idea, this bayonet attack so-called, where white plays bishop e2, and of course, if they play knight f3 or h3, they're playing the classical, but they play h4. And as I said, you don't want to castle into this. There's no reason to castle into this. It would be too scary. And you can ignore it technically, but I prefer just playing the move h5. And eventually, according to my experience and the opening book, both sides are going to be castling kingside anyway. So why are the pawns on h4 and h5? I don't know. We have access to the g4 square. White, of course, has access to the g5 square. And after something like this, white really should castle. I think the engine thinks so too. So whether they insert these two moves or not doesn't really matter. You're going to be playing the classical Pirc with pawns on h4 and h5. One good thing is that h3 can no longer be played, meaning that you can always go bishop g4 and exchange your annoying bishop. Okay, so that was the Pirc repertoire. Once again, it's in the description below. Follow that link if you want to get it, and let me know what you think. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.